Have you ever trusted someone so completely, only to have that trust shattered? This is my story of betrayal, heartbreak, and a year-long journey to find peace. My name is Katie. I'm 35, and I live in a cozy apartment right in the heart of Seattle. Seattle's rainy days and misty skyline have a comforting, quiet charm. I work as a financial analyst for a small investment firm, a stable job that lets me live independently and take care of myself. One of the most valued parts of my life is my friendship with Jenny, my best friend since childhood. We grew up together in a small town just an hour outside of Seattle. We were inseparable, sharing everything from secrets to dreams, spending summers running through the fields, picking wild berries, and lying under the stars, talking about what the future might hold. Our bond has only grown stronger over the years. Even now, as adults, Jenny is the person I share everything with, the small joys, the worries, and our hopes for what's to come. Now Jenny has a partner, Eric. They've been together for almost 2 years, and they're expecting their first child. Eric is a quiet, thoughtful man, steady and kind. Though he doesn't talk much, his actions say a lot. The way he looks at Jenny, with genuine care and warmth, shows he truly values her. I remember once when the three of us were out to dinner, Jenny, in her first trimester, suddenly had a craving for dessert. Without a word, Eric went out to find her favorite cake and brought it back, much to her delight. These small, thoughtful gestures revealed just how cherished Jenny is. After Jenny found out she was pregnant, she and Eric started planning their wedding. They both wanted a simple, intimate ceremony with only close friends and family, something meaningful yet modest. Jenny had her heart set on an outdoor wedding at a small farm outside the city, surrounded by the quiet beauty of nature. She told me, laughing, that I'd be her maid of honor and that we'd spend a day together picking out the perfect dresses for both of us. Eric, too, was deeply invested in planning their wedding, determined that every detail would be perfect. From selecting flowers for the reception to arranging seating for guests, he put thought into every aspect. He even planned to build a wooden swing in the garden of their new home, a peaceful spot where he and Jenny could sit together, watching the sunset and telling stories to their child. Each time Jenny shared these plans, her happiness was unmistakable. Eric's love for her showed not only in his words, but in the care and effort he put into every detail of their future. As Jenny's best friend, I was thrilled to see her so happy and starting this new chapter in her life. On weekends, we'd go shopping together, picking out outfits for the wedding and tiny clothes for the baby. We'd laugh and picture the future with Jenny as a mom, surrounded by the family she'd always dreamed of. Seeing her joy and excitement made me feel hopeful that she was heading toward a beautiful, loving family life. Yet, even with all these happy moments, a faint sense of unease began to settle in. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something seemed slightly off, just a subtle feeling I couldn't explain. After that dinner, I started noticing subtle changes in Jenny's behavior. She'd always been open and honest with me, we could talk about anything. Good news or bad, she was usually the first to call, sharing every detail. But now, it felt like an invisible wall had gone up between us. She was becoming more withdrawn, more secretive, as if she were hiding something. One instance stood out when we met up for coffee. Jenny arrived late, looking exhausted. Her face was pale, and there was a tiredness in her eyes, like she hadn't been sleeping well. When I asked if she was okay, she managed a forced smile and said work had been keeping her busy. It was a reasonable enough explanation, but her avoidance of eye contact and her overall appearance made me feel uneasy. During that coffee meetup, I noticed her glancing at her phone often, only to quickly turn it face down on the table, as if she didn't want me to see. This wasn't like her. Jenny had never hidden anything from me before. And when I asked her about work, she responded vaguely, which was unusual. Normally, she'd be happy to share all the details. Her brief, guarded answers left me suspicious, even if I couldn't quite figure out why. After that, I started paying closer attention. She used to come home at a predictable time, and if she was running late, she would always let Eric know. But recently, she had begun staying out later without notice, and there were even times when she didn't come home at all. Eric called me once, his voice full of worry, asking if I knew where she was. Apparently, she had told him she was out with friends, but hadn't returned. I didn't know what to tell him, but I could sense that Jenny was keeping secrets, not just from Eric, but from me too. The unease I felt only grew as her unusual behavior continued. One afternoon, when we met for lunch, she arrived looking tense, as though she'd just been through a difficult conversation. She sat down, took her coffee, and stared blankly ahead, her mind clearly elsewhere. When I asked if everything was okay, she brushed off my question, insisting she was fine, though it was clear she didn't want to discuss anything further. As the days went by, Jenny became more distant. She had once been so easy to read, always open about her feelings, but now, it was as if a shadow had settled between us. Each time I mentioned Eric, she would respond quickly and then change the subject, which she had never done before. Eric had once been her world. She used to talk about him with a bright smile, her eyes full of admiration. But now, whenever his name came up, she seemed to withdraw, her expression distant and uncomfortable. Then, there was an unusual moment when Jenny came by my place to return a book I'd lent her. I noticed something in her purse, a second phone. It was sleek and new, without a case, as if it had been bought recently. I was taken aback. Jenny had never needed two phones before, and it wasn't like her to keep something like that hidden. Seeing the phone stirred a sense of suspicion in me, though I tried to brush it off as maybe just a work device. Still, the unease lingered. I wanted to ask her directly about it, but I held back, not wanting to cross a line. I told myself it was likely something simple, something that didn't require my concern. But despite my attempts to ignore it, the doubt remained, and each day it grew harder to overlook. Then, another incident heightened my suspicion. We were at our usual cafe, chatting, when Jenny received a text message. She glanced at her phone, her face tightening briefly before she stood up and stepped outside to take the call. She was speaking quietly, so I couldn't make out the conversation. When she returned, she seemed flustered and immediately changed the subject to avoid any questions. It was clear she was hiding something, and the unease I'd felt only deepened. Each small change on its own seemed insignificant, but together, they painted a troubling picture. Jenny was no longer the open friend I'd always known. Her vague answers, her subtle but noticeable changes in behavior, and her increasingly guarded nature were hard to ignore. I wanted to believe she was still the same honest friend, but the doubts kept returning, casting a shadow over our friendship and leaving me with a growing sense of concern. A few weeks later, Jenny and I decided to go to an outdoor music festival together. The atmosphere was lively, with music echoing over the open fields and strings of lights hanging from the trees. Laughter and the sounds of people singing along filled the air, adding to the energy of the crowd around us. Jenny and I joined in, dancing and shouting to the beat, letting go of all our worries. I hadn't seen her so carefree in a long time, and for a moment, my recent doubts about her behavior seemed to fade into the joy of the moment. But that feeling of ease didn't last. Halfway through the festival, I realized that Jenny wasn't with me at our camp spot anymore. Looking around, I finally spotted her at the edge of the woods, walking alongside a man I didn't recognize. They stood close, talking and laughing together with an ease that was hard to ignore. Occasionally, he leaned in to whisper something, and she responded with a smile I hadn't seen in a long time. Her whole demeanor seemed different, light-hearted, as if completely absorbed in her own private world with this stranger. Seeing Jenny, my closest friend, someone I'd always thought of as trustworthy and genuine, acting so intimately with this unknown man, was unsettling. Their gestures, lingering glances, and the closeness between them all pointed to something beyond just a friendly conversation. Then, as I thought of the child she was carrying, I felt a deeper concern. Jenny wasn't just my best friend, she was a mother-to-be, and what I was witnessing seemed far from the responsible, caring person I thought I knew. When Jenny eventually returned to our spot, I couldn't stay silent. I waited until she settled down, then took a deep breath and spoke plainly. "Jenny, don't you think this is going too far? You're pregnant, and Eric is trusting you. If you keep going like this, you're risking a lot for yourself and the baby." Her reaction, though, left me stunned. Instead of showing concern, she smirked, her tone indifferent as she replied, "Katie, you're so old-fashioned. Men can't stay faithful, so why should women have to?" Her words hit hard. It was difficult to reconcile this attitude with the friend I trusted and cared for. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Jenny, this isn't just about you. You're carrying a child. You have a responsibility, not only to yourself, but to the life growing inside you. And what about Eric? How would he feel if he knew?" Jenny only shrugged, her tone dismissive and challenging. "Eric doesn't need to know, and even if he did, there's nothing he could do. This is my life, Katie. I'll live it how I want." Her indifference and the coldness in her voice made it feel as though the person sitting next to me was a stranger, someone who couldn't, or wouldn't, see the potential harm her choices might bring. In that moment, it became clear that a distance had formed between us. The friend I'd known, trusted, and shared so much of my life with now seemed like a different person, someone who looked right through me, unaffected by the consequences of her actions. I sat there quietly, the weight of disappointment settling in as I looked at her. We'd been through so much together, yet now, it felt as if I no longer recognized the person beside me. On the way home, I was lost in thought, my mind turning over the questions I'd been avoiding. Should I keep trying to reach Jenny, or had our friendship reached a point where I could no longer help her? Deep down, I realized that the Jenny I once knew seemed to be gone, replaced by someone unfamiliar and distant. After that night at the music festival, I found myself torn between my friendship with Jenny and my own conscience. Jenny wasn't just any friend, she was my childhood best friend, someone who had been by my side through every high and low. But the choices she was making felt undeniably wrong, and the weight of that realization was getting harder to ignore. Many nights, I would sit alone, grappling with the same questions. If I told Eric everything, he'd know the truth and could protect himself and their unborn child. But I knew that doing so would likely mean losing Jenny's friendship forever. She would see me as a traitor, someone who crossed a line that couldn't be undone. The conflict weighed heavily, pulling me in opposite directions. Every time I thought of Eric, it stirred something painful in me. He was a genuinely kind person who had invested everything into his future with Jenny. He'd confided in me so many times about his hopes for their child, his dreams of building a warm, loving home. I remembered how excitedly he had talked about becoming a father and how he'd already begun preparing for it with so much dedication. The more I thought about this, the more the guilt built up, knowing he was unaware of what was happening behind his back. There were nights when I lay awake, my mind running through possible outcomes. I imagined Jenny's reaction, her anger, her sense of betrayal if she discovered I'd told her secret. And then, there was the thought of their child, who would be born into a situation complicated by choices and secrets beyond their control. These possibilities haunted me, bringing with them a constant, inescapable sense of dread. In search of clarity, I turned to an anonymous forum, hoping advice from people outside the situation would help. But the responses were mixed. Some urged me to tell Eric, arguing that sometimes the painful truth is necessary to save a relationship. They believed my silence might only enable Jenny to keep making mistakes, causing even more harm to Eric and their child. Others suggested I respect Jenny's privacy, pointing out that it was her life and her choices to make. They warned that if I interfered, I could lose a friendship I'd never be able to rebuild. The conflicting advice left me feeling even more lost, as if I were caught in a maze with no clear way out. Each option seemed to lead in a different direction, yet none of them felt like the right answer. It became clear that this was a decision I had to make alone. But what was the right choice? Would staying silent truly preserve our friendship, or was honesty the only way to find peace? As time passed, I found myself avoiding Jenny more and more. I made excuses to skip our usual meetups, fearing that if I saw her, the uncertainty and guilt would show on my face. I wasn't ready to confront her and didn't want to be forced into a decision I couldn't handle. But by distancing myself, I felt a new wave of guilt, as if I were abandoning her when she might need support the most. It was a painful struggle, torn between wanting to protect her and feeling an obligation to reveal the truth. One day, at a familiar cafe where we often met, Jenny brought up her worries about the baby and the future. But there was a detachment in her voice, as if she were just going through the motions. For a moment, I looked into her eyes, hoping to see some acknowledgement of her choices and the effect they could have on those around her. But all I saw was indifference, a casual disregard that left me questioning if she even understood the consequences of her actions or thought she could keep everything hidden. At that moment, it became clear to me, no matter what I decided, there would be a cost. If I stayed silent, I might keep my friendship with Jenny, but I would carry the guilt of enabling her deception. If I told Eric, I would likely lose Jenny, but I might finally free myself from the burden of keeping her secret. In the end, I understood that there was no perfect answer, only the difficult choice between what felt right and what felt safe. One day, as I was sitting in my living room, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. When I opened the door, there stood Eric, looking exhausted and worn. Dark circles under his eyes and a heaviness in his expression made it clear he hadn't slept well, if at all. We just stood there for a moment in silence before I invited him in, and we settled on the sofa, an air of tension and sorrow filling the room. For a while, neither of us spoke. Only the ticking of the clock broke the silence, as if he were gathering the strength to speak. Finally, Eric sighed, his voice low and weary. Lately, I don't even recognize Jenny anymore. He looked at me, confusion and pain evident in his gaze. She's not the open, happy person she used to be. When I try to talk to her, she either brushes me off or gets annoyed. His voice wavered slightly, and his hands tightened with worry. I know she's pregnant, and mood swings are normal, but this feels different. It's like she's slipping away. I listened quietly, taking in every word. Eric went on, explaining how Jenny had started coming home late without any clear explanation, something she'd never done before. She would offer vague excuses, saying she was working late or had errands, but each time he asked, her answers felt distant, even dismissive. I wait for her every night, wondering where she is and who she's with, he admitted, his voice weighed down by worry, but I'm afraid if I push too hard, she'll only drift further away. His words painted a picture of a man who once seemed strong and competent in his relationship, now left feeling lost. He continued, describing a change in Jenny's behavior that I, too, had noticed, her attachment to her phone. She keeps it with her constantly, even in the bathroom, he explained, frustration evident. Every time a message or call comes, she glances at it, then steps out of the room to take it. She never used to act like this. I never had a reason to doubt her, but now, each time I see her clutching that phone, I get this awful feeling in my gut. Hearing this, I felt a knot tighten inside me as I recalled that night at the music festival, the image of Jenny with the stranger still fresh in my mind. Part of me wanted to tell him, to reveal what I'd seen, but I hesitated, knowing the consequences, the risk of losing Jenny, my closest friend. Eric's voice softened, his tone strained as he continued. I've even tried asking if she's feeling stressed, if there's anything I can do. But she just looked at me coldly and told me not to interfere, that she could handle it herself. It felt like a slap in the face. All I wanted was to be there for her, to support her, but it's like she's pushing me away. His voice trembled, each word revealing more of his vulnerability. He looked down, barely whispering, Katie, I just want Jenny to be the woman I fell in love with, the one I trusted with everything. I dreamed of a happy family, of holding our first child together. But with everything that's happening, I don't know if she's truly ready to be a mother or if she's drifting further away from this family. As Eric spoke, his words felt like a weight pressing down. I wanted to tell him the truth, to lift the fog of uncertainty that was overwhelming him, but fear held me back. I was terrified of the consequences of betraying Jenny's trust, afraid I would lose the friend who had been by my side for so long. When Eric finally left, I stood in the doorway, watching as he walked away, his shoulders slumped under a weight he could barely carry. The conflict between my loyalty to Jenny and the truth I held felt like a tightening noose. My silence was becoming a burden, and I began to wonder if keeping the truth hidden was the right thing to do. Would revealing it shatter everything, or help Eric see the reality he was facing? 6. After many sleepless nights, I finally decided that the truth had to come out. Watching Eric, a genuinely kind man who loved Jenny deeply, being deceived weighed on me more each day. Each time I saw the trust and affection in his eyes, I knew I couldn't stay silent. While I didn't want to destroy my friendship with Jenny, I also knew Eric deserved to know the truth. I wrestled with the decision for several nights, questioning whether I had the courage to send an anonymous message. Finally, one quiet night, as everything around me lay still, I sat by the window, watching the sparse traffic below. Taking a deep breath, I opened my phone, launched the messaging app, and carefully selected each photo from the music festival, the photos I had accidentally taken of Jenny with a stranger, walking hand in hand and exchanging intimate glances. I drafted the message, typing and deleting, trying to keep it simple but clear, wanting to minimize the pain. Finally, I sent it. There's something you should know about Jenny. Take a look at these photos and find the answer yourself. My heart raced as I hit send, and in that moment, it felt like a line had been crossed that I could never go back on. I knew the friendship with Jenny might not survive this, but I could no longer ignore the truth. From here on, everything was beyond my control. The next morning, I heard through a mutual friend that Eric had received the message. He hadn't gone to work and wasn't answering calls or texts. I could picture him, sitting alone, staring at those photos, the betrayal now painfully clear. I knew I'd added to his hurt, but I also believed that sometimes, painful truths need to come out. A few days later, Eric confronted Jenny. He walked into their apartment, mentally prepared for what lay ahead. He looked exhausted, his eyes weary and red from countless sleepless nights. Jenny, already anxious, seemed to read the pain in his face. "I have something I need you to explain, Jenny," Eric said, his voice low but filled with disappointment. When he showed her the photos, she froze. The evidence of her betrayal lay in front of her, undeniable. Unable to look him in the eyes, she eventually lowered her gaze and, voice trembling, offered a tearful apology. "Eric, I'm really sorry. It was just a moment of weakness. I never meant to hurt you. It's over now. It wasn't anything serious." Eric shook his head, hurt and disappointment evident. "You think a simple apology is enough, Jenny? I trusted you more than anyone. I put all my faith in our love. And just because of one weak moment, you've destroyed everything." His words cut deeply. Jenny reached for his hand, but he pulled back, his gaze cold and distant. She pleaded, her voice choked, "Eric, please, give me a chance to make it right. I'll change, I swear." But Eric remained silent, his expression distant. Jenny realized that his trust was shattered and that regretful words couldn't undo the hurt she'd caused. A few days later, Jenny came to see me. As she sat across from me in our familiar coffee shop, she looked exhausted, her eyes dark and swollen from lack of sleep. She broke down as soon as she saw me, her voice shaking. "Katie, I don't know what to do anymore. Eric will forgive me. Please, just help me this once. Tell him it wasn't anything serious, just a lapse in judgment. You know me. I never meant to hurt him." Her plea left me silent for a moment. This was the friend I'd shared so much with, yet this time, I knew I couldn't help her. She had made her choice, and now she had to face the consequences. Keeping my voice steady, I replied, "Jenny, I can't help you this time. Eric deserves the truth, and it's time for you to take responsibility for what you've done." Jenny sat there, wide-eyed and stunned, as if unable to believe what she'd heard. Without a word, she lowered her head, sorrow etched in her face. I could sense her despair, but my decision stood firm. We sat together in silence, the weight between us heavy and unmoving. Eventually, Jenny stood, her gaze empty, and walked out of the cafe. I watched her retreating figure, knowing that our friendship was beyond repair, a bond shattered, like a mirror that could never be pieced back together. After everything was exposed, Eric found himself unable to forgive Jenny. The betrayal had shattered the trust he once had in her. Though he still cared for her, the weight of the pain and disappointment was overwhelming. One day, he told her of his decision to leave. Jenny pleaded with him, begging him to stay, but Eric's expression remained hollow, his resolve unshaken. For him, all hope and trust were gone. A few days later, Eric returned to collect his belongings, marking the final end of their relationship. As he packed, Jenny stood by, helpless, watching the life they had built together come to an end. In her desperation and sorrow, she turned to me, her oldest friend, searching for someone to blame. One evening, she appeared at my door, not for comfort or to apologize, but to vent her fury. "It's all your fault," she shouted, her voice sharp with anger. "If you hadn't meddled, Eric would never have found out. You destroyed my life, Katie. Who gave you the right to interfere in my choices?" Her accusation struck hard. I stood there, listening in stunned silence as she continued, her words filled with bitterness. "You're nothing but a traitor," she spat. "You pretended to be my friend, but you stabbed me in the back. You were jealous, weren't you? Jealous of my happiness and my life. That's why you ruined everything." Hearing this from a friend I had loved and trusted for so many years was painful. I looked at Jenny, trying to keep my composure, but it was clear she wasn't open to reason. She needed someone to blame, and I was the easiest target. "Jenny," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I did this because I care about you and Eric. But you have to take responsibility for your choices." Jenny glared at me, her face filled with rage. "I hate you, Katie. I hate you for ruining my life." She stormed off, leaving behind a sense of emptiness that I knew would never be filled. In that moment, I realized our friendship was irreparably broken, like a shattered mirror that could never be pieced back together. After Eric left, Jenny faced her reality alone. With no one by her side, she had to navigate the final months of her pregnancy, bearing the weight of her mistakes and the consequences. Each night, she lay awake, overwhelmed by fear and uncertainty about the future. When her labor began, it arrived sooner than expected, turning into one of the most challenging experiences of her life. Alone in pain and panic, she called an ambulance herself, completed the hospital admission forms on her own, and entered the labor room without a familiar face nearby. After hours of struggling, she finally heard her baby's first cry. She looked at the tiny life in her arms, tears streaming down her face as conflicting emotions washed over her. Holding her child brought both joy and a profound sorrow for all she had lost. The early days of motherhood proved just as challenging. With no one to help, Jenny managed every feeding, every sleepless night, and every cry on her own. Exhausted and overwhelmed, there were moments when she felt like giving up, but each time she looked at her child's innocent face, she found the strength to keep going. Jenny's life settled into a routine of relentless struggle and solitude. To make ends meet, she took on any job she could find, serving tables, cleaning houses, just to afford the basics like formula and diapers. Her old friends drifted away, leaving her more isolated than ever, with no one to lean on or share her burdens. Late at night, when her child was finally asleep, Jenny would sit quietly by the crib, haunted by memories of the life she once had. Though she continued to resent me, blaming me for her circumstances, she also knew that her choices had brought her to this point. She understood that this life was the price of her mistakes, and her responsibility now was to care for and protect her child, ensuring they would never face the same pain she had endured. 1 year later, on a rainy, gray afternoon, I received an unexpected message from Jenny. Her words were brief but filled with emotion. She apologized and asked if we could meet. She wrote about the past year's struggles, the weight of her mistakes, and the regret she felt over her actions and the hurtful words she'd thrown at me. There was a sincere hope in her message. Perhaps we could start over and try to rebuild our friendship. As I read her message, memories of our friendship came back, years of laughter, secrets, and unwavering support. Jenny had been like a sister to me, someone I'd trusted deeply. But those memories were quickly shadowed by the sting of her betrayal and the bitterness of her words and anger. The wound she left was still raw, and I wasn't sure I could simply let it go. A part of me wanted to forgive her, to release the pain and try to reclaim the friendship we once had. But another part of me, still feeling hurt and wary, held back, questioning if a friendship scarred by broken trust could ever truly heal. I wondered if forgiveness was worth it. Could I let her back into my life, knowing the damage that had been done? Sitting there, I realized how lonely the past year had been. Jenny hadn't just been a friend, she had been a core part of my life, someone who understood me like few others did. Losing her felt like losing a part of myself, leaving an empty space I hadn't been able to fill. But was I ready to let go of the pain she had caused? Could I find the strength to release the resentment that had become so familiar? After much thought, I decided to meet Jenny. I didn't know if I could fully forgive her, but I felt that we both needed closure, a chance to confront the past, acknowledge mistakes, and perhaps find some peace. We met on a quiet autumn afternoon. The sun filtered through the golden leaves, casting a warm light over the park. Jenny arrived, looking worn and cautious. She sat across from me and began to speak, her voice filled with remorse. She talked about the difficulties of the past year, the challenges of raising her child alone, and the isolation that had forced her to confront the consequences of her choices. As she spoke, there was a genuine regret in her eyes, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. She admitted that she had wanted to reach out many times but had been afraid I would reject her, too ashamed to face the hurt she had caused. Her voice trembled as she apologized not only for what she had done to me, but also for the pain she'd inflicted on Eric and her child. Jenny confessed that her selfishness and recklessness had cost her everything she once valued, leaving her with a life she hardly recognized. Her words softened something in me, slowly easing the hardness that had built up over the past year. Even as I listened, I hesitated. My life had changed since losing her friendship. I had new routines, even new friends who helped fill the void she left. But there was something familiar in her sincerity, something I thought I'd lost. Sensing my hesitation, Jenny looked at me, her eyes pleading. "Katie," she said softly, "I know I can't ask you to forgive me right away, but I hope we can start over, even if it's just small steps. I want to try to rebuild what we lost, if you'll let me." Her honesty touched something deep within me. Maybe we had both grown through the mistakes and the pain, discovering new aspects of ourselves in the process. I knew it wouldn't be easy, and I knew our friendship might never be the same. But perhaps it was worth trying to rebuild. I nodded gently, meeting her gaze, and in that moment, we shared an unspoken understanding, a fragile, uncertain beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. We spent hours talking that afternoon, sharing stories of the past year, the struggles we'd faced, and the lessons we'd learned. There were moments of laughter and moments of quiet reflection as we tentatively started to rediscover the bond we had once shared. It was far from perfect, but for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope, a hope that, maybe, over time, we could find our way back to each other. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park, I felt a sense of peace. Forgiveness, I realized, might not be an instant decision, but rather a journey, a gradual release, a willingness to let go. And with each small step we took, the bitterness within me seemed to fade, replaced by a cautious, fragile trust. We left the park that day knowing the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but we were both willing to try. We had hurt each other in ways neither of us could completely erase, but we'd also shared a bond that had run deep. And as we walked away, side by side, I felt a renewed sense of hope that, despite everything, maybe we could one day rebuild what had been lost.